All right, hey, it's Rob, and I'm going to talk today about a guy who I have spoken about before in my videos. His name is Bryan Loren, and he is a producer that worked with Michael Jackson. He put a lot of work into the Dangerous album, and I feel like he really kind of was treated unfairly. As I said, he got a raw deal because none of the songs that he worked on, ultimately ended up on the record. Dangerous. So let me tell you a little bit about Bryan's backstory. I was familiar with him because he had a song called Lollipop Love, which I had heard previous to the release of Dangerous in the 80s. I think, I don't remember exactly when that song came out. But anyway, he's my age. He was born in 1966. Grew up, I think, on Long Island, moved to Philadelphia, got involved in music. What I'm reading here says that he was involved in the recording of We Are the World. I don't remember ever hearing that, and I haven't fact-checked that, but that's what I'm seeing here, so maybe he had some involvement in that. Anyway, at some point, he, crossed paths with Michael Jackson. If he worked on We Are the World, well, maybe that's where he met him. I don't know. Anyway, but we're going to fast forward to 1989, which was when he started working on the record Dangerous. 1989 was the year that I moved out to Los Angeles, and I started working at the studio where they were recording Dangerous, I believe sometime around April, maybe March or April of 1990. I give little quick disclaimers when I do my Michael Jackson content on this channel, which is that, yes, I worked, at the studio where Michael recorded Dangerous. I did see him every day and said hello, and we were friendly. But my job was not anything that was important or significant. I literally was the guy that picked up lunch at the studio. I just did a podcast where I was interviewed about, my experiences with Michael. And the interviewer said, what were your responsibilities at the studio? And literally my job was to just sit there and be available so that if someone needed to send me out somewhere in my car, they would just walk up to me or whatever. They got in touch with me somehow on the phone. So this was way before cell phones, by the way. And they sent me out to lunch, or maybe I had to pick up some equipment. I had to pick up some crazy stuff. Once I had to go pick up underwear from Michael Jackson. You can see all these videos on my channel if you are interested in more MJ content. Anyway, so Bryan Loren was there when I started around March or April 1990. He was one of three main production teams that started working on Dangerous. They added a fourth, which would have been Teddy Riley, later on in the project, but Teddy came along way after Bryan was already gone. So at the beginning, it was Bruce Swedien, of course, Michael's longtime engineer, who had moved up to the role of producer. He had kind of promoted himself to producer because Quincy Jones was not in the picture for the record Dangerous. Of course, this was Michael's first attempt to produce himself, to be in charge of the whole project. And, there were a lot of things that were involved, like politically, when it comes to the fact that Michael was in charge of this project himself and did not have anybody overseeing it, like Quincy Jones, a producer who could make decisions and, keep the schedule going and keep moving along. So I've discussed the politics of Dangerous on another video. I don't want to get too far into it, but basically there were different teams. There was Bruce Swedien. There was Bill Bottrell, who is an engineer, a producer, a songwriter. Bill had Black or White and Give In to Me, and probably something else I'm not thinking of that ended up on Dangerous. And so those were the major players at the time, and Bryan was there in the mix with all those people. They were working on many, many songs. It's estimated to be 20 or 25 songs for Dangerous. It's very possible. A lot of them I don't feel like I ever heard at that time. I can remember the songs that were coming through the door. There was Superfly Sister and To Satisfy You, the only two songs that Bryan worked on that eventually got released, I believe. Other songs they worked on that I remember hearing all the time, Serious Effect, that's the one I remember hearing the most. I was very surprised that didn't, end up on the record ultimately, because they worked on that, for days and days and days and weeks and months. They had Work That Body. It was a song called Men in Black, Deep in the Night, She Got It, 7 Digits. There's one called Don't Believe It, All the Truth, Call It Off. Those are titles that may be just working titles. Again, a lot of them I'm just not familiar with, but I do certainly remember Bryan being in there. Every day he worked in the studio that we called Studio A in the front part of the studio. Studio B was the much bigger studio in the back with the giant tracking room where you could have an orchestra and giant choirs and that kind of stuff. Those were the studios where mainly Bill Bottrell and Bruce Swedien worked. So for the first, I said it was 6 months, but it's probably, somewhere between 6 months and a year, maybe 9 or 10 months. Bryan Loren was in there every day. And some days he would be, working with Michael directly. Some days he would be working on Michael's music. Some days he would just be kind of sitting around because there really wasn't much to do. And I'll get into that later and talk about, eventually why Bryan ended up, being pushed off the project. So my experience was, like I said, they would work on different songs at different times. And because Michael was the one in charge and not Quincy, well, it's like there was no real organization. There was no real schedule. And basically what you did, if you were a guy like Bryan Loren or his engineer, his name was Richard Cottrell, they would just come in every day and they would just wait to see what Michael decided that he wanted to work on that day. Now, he may have been working in the other studio, Studio B, and he may be working in there for 3 days or 4 days or a week, which means you're sitting around just doing this, twiddling your thumbs in a studio. You're being paid. Obviously, they were paid for their time. Or maybe you're working, on the song on your own without Michael's input. But it was a strange situation because, again, there was no schedule. I don't believe that they ever really knew, except maybe the day before where they'd say, all right, we're going to come in tomorrow and work on this song again or whatever. But so it was, just an unusual situation because this is a very high profile project. And of course, this is Michael Jackson. But you had this one team who just kind of fell by the wayside where, they worked on the songs that Bryan Loren had brought to the project and they spent a lot of time on them. But then there were weeks where there was just really nothing going on in that studio. So Bryan got involved in this song, Do the Bartman. That was recorded in Studio A of Record One in Sherman Oaks, California. Of course, Do the Bartman ended up being a music video, and, it was the characters from The Simpsons and a rap that Bart Simpson had to do. And so the woman that did the voice of Bart Simpson came in and she did the rap, and that was cool. And Michael, was happy to have this song being worked on in the studio because he thought the Simpsons were really funny and related to Bart Simpson. It's been said that he had a lot more involvement in that song, but my experience was that other than just sitting and listening to it, or maybe, giving a couple suggestions or whatever, pretty much Do the Bartman was all Bryan Loren. And Michael got a lot of credit, and they said Michael sang background vocals and all this stuff. I don't feel like there's really much of Michael in that song at all, other than his spirit and his enthusiasm for the Simpsons and, being there at the studio when it was recorded. Like I said, that came out and it was released, and Bryan Loren got a little bit of attention for that song, but it really was not connected to Dangerous or, anything much to do with Michael Jackson, except for the fact that we did it in the studio during the recording of the album Dangerous. It was, obviously a whole separate thing. And other than that, all those songs they worked on during Dangerous and everything just kind of fell by the wayside and did not end up on the final version of Dangerous. There's a podcast about Bryan Loren, the MJ podcast, where he talks about his frustrations, and rightly so, and I really feel for the guy. He was a hard worker. He came in every day, at least in the beginning, and there were just periods during that, the recording of Dangerous, where weeks would go by, and Michael would just not be working on any of the songs that, Bryan had prepared and that they had been, recording for, months and months and months. Now, it may have been that Michael lost interest in the songs. It may have been that he just decided he didn't like working with them as much as the other things they were working on, or he just got interested in other things. It's really hard to say. But what I remember, and I don't need to go on forever, was that they worked on this large group of songs for, months and months and months. And then, Michael's attention got diverted elsewhere. It was very competitive and political. And of course, if you were working with Michael that day, well, that's great, because that means your song is a little closer to, the finish line. If you're adding another part, if you're doing a mix, if you're doing this, if you're doing that, you're getting further to the point, where the song will eventually be in its final finished state and, will be up for consideration for the record. So, if you know anything about music and royalties and whatever, well, if you get a song on a record, that means that you have a guaranteed income, especially a huge record like Michael Jackson, and Dangerous. You're going to see money from that for the rest of your life. So obviously you have a real strong interest in making sure your song is as good as it can be, but also that it can, be considered for, part of this project that you're working on. So anyway, as the months went on, Michael spent less and less time in that Studio A, that front studio with Bryan Loren, and they would dutifully show up every day for weeks and weeks and weeks. They showed up every day. Usually Michael would say he wanted a cassette copy of something. They would run off a cassette copy. That would be like their only task during the day. They would maybe run off a copy or do a mix, a quick mix, a rough mix, whatever, of one or two songs. They had really just not much going on. And eventually, I think Bryan got frustrated with it and started to feel like, all right, Michael is, passing us by here and moving on to different songs, and, he's not really considering these or whatever, or he's lost interest. And so they stopped showing up. It kind of makes sense. You show up every day at a job where you have nothing to do for weeks on end, even though you're getting paid and it's a big high-profile thing. Well, at some point, like I said, they just stopped showing up. Well, it's understandable. Got bored. Why am I even here? I'm not doing anything. Well, one day Michael went into that Studio A and expected Bryan, or, at least the engineer Richard, to be there, and they hadn't shown up. Neither one of them had. So they probably got interested in working on something else that they felt like was, more worthy of, spending time on than to show up every day in a studio where you're just not needed or wanted or, anything like that. So I remember Michael went into the studio, the lights were off, turned on the lights, there was nobody in there, he had a certain kind of look on his face, and I feel like, his expectation was that, I'm paying you, you're part of this project, that you need to be here every day, when I decide that, I want to work with you, even if weeks and weeks and weeks have gone by where I really haven't done anything, like you should have been there. So it was a conflict, and, it was a little bit of drama. And then just after that point, they just were kind of removed from the project. And, I don't remember any big dramatic thing happening or whatever, but we just stopped seeing them. They stopped showing up. Of course, the songs were still there and they were in the vault, and it's very possible they could have at some point been reconsidered. And I think a couple of Bryan's songs made it to Teddy Riley, who then did some additional work on them or whatever. Like I said, a couple of the songs finally came out years later. Superfly Sister and To Satisfy You were released. I don't know exactly where, but it might have been on one of those posthumous releases after Michael passed away, or maybe one of the box sets, or the 25th anniversary, or this or that, or whatever. So eventually he got a couple of things out, but I have heard him speak. Like I said, he's expressed his frustration, and I'm making this video because I really do feel for the guy, because he put in a lot of hard work, and for many, many months he was there dutifully showing up every day to a job where he wasn't needed or wanted, or he wasn't the priority. And all these songs are sitting around there, and even to this day, many of them, they have leaked out, and we can hear them, and we can go to YouTube or wherever and hear the demos, not in their finished state, but as far along as they were developed, until finally they just stopped showing up, and Michael just decided they weren't going to be part of the project anymore. But I'm not sure how all that stuff went down. I don't remember any confrontation or anything like that. I'm sure probably Michael didn't even do it. He had his management or someone reach out and say, all right, we're going to terminate this contract at this point or whatever. But anyway, it's as much as I remember about Bryan Loren. He was a nice guy. I enjoyed working with him and seeing him every day. And, I helped him out like I helped anybody else out who happened to be in that studio. And, it's very surprising that, he worked on these songs. I feel like his songs were at least as good as a couple of the Teddy Riley songs on the record, which I feel like, and I've said many times, were not up to the standard of the other songs on Dangerous. And it, should have just, been one of Bryan's songs instead of one of Teddy's songs, maybe, just to get him on the record and help him out a little bit. But for whatever reason, and I don't know the, politics or whatever happened, none of his songs eventually ended up on the record, even though there were, hundreds of hours of work and, dozens and dozens of tapes. And like they said, a couple dozen songs, 20 to 25 songs ultimately, or at least, they would work on grooves or bass lines or melodies or this or that. And anyway, so that's the story of Bryan Loren and Dangerous. And, it's just sad that after all that work, he didn't have much to show for it. Of course, where you really make your money is in royalties and, in getting millions of copies of a record press that has one of your songs on it. And, he just wasn't able to participate in that way like other people were who were involved in the project. And since then, I'm sure he's worked on, many other records with different artists and things like that. I didn't go into his whole history, but this was really his one big shot, or at least at that time, to get on one of the biggest records, in the world with, arguably the most famous entertainer that's ever existed on planet Earth. And, he worked very hard and tried his best, and ultimately just, didn't quite get to that point where the songs were, included on the record. And that's it. That's the story of Bryan Loren, as much as I can remember from 30 plus years ago. All right. Thanks for watching. Appreciate it. You can hear all those songs, like I said, leaked out, and you could listen to them and hear what they sound like, and tell me what you think of them if you listen to a couple of them. A few of them, like I said, were very good songs and, easily could have been on the final version of Dangerous, but for whatever reason, just didn't end up that way. All right. Thanks for watching. Bye.